All right, stream's up.
All right.
All right, so I think I'm just going to get the video open very quickly. All right, so just respond to. I'm going to bring up the Pax Tube video about Ukraine. So, all right, share screen. All right, ready?
Ready.
All right, join the stream. Are you watching?
I am watching. Yes.
Yep.
The Russia-Ukraine war is perhaps the most geopolitically important event in our lifetimes, yet it's also one of the most misunderstood. While many people today think this war began out of nowhere in 2022, the true...
Nobody thinks that.
Absolutely nobody does. Like, anybody who's done the slightest amount of research knows that it began at least with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Like, most people who were following the news back then remember that.
Yeah. So the whole argument's kind of a straw man from the start.
Roots of this conflict go back decades, and the causes of the conflict involve much more than just Ukraine and Russia. America, the United Kingdom, and NATO have their fingerprints all over this war from start to finish. Before and since 2022, NATO governments led by the United States have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the Ukrainian government. As of today, we can say that this is a true proxy war between Russia and the leading members of NATO. Those aren't just my words. The new US Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitted this.
And frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine and Russia.
The extent of American involvement is to such a high degree that it may be more accurate to call this the Russia-America war than the Russia-Ukraine war. Therefore, knowing the history of the relationship between Russia and the United States in recent decades is of paramount importance.
American troops are not in Russia.
American troops are not killing Russian troops on the battlefield. It is not the Russia-America war. If it was, the Russians would have been crushed long ago. I mean, like, if it was a limited Gulf War style operation to drive them out of the territories of Ukraine, entirely conventionally, we could have done that real easily, right?
Yeah. Yeah, basically saying if America truly went to war with Russia, it's already be over.
Yeah, Russia would be dead. Like, we have more, our nukes probably work better than theirs. It's, so yeah, like, you can tell it's not the Russia-America war because Russia still exists.
Even disregarding nukes, it would have beat them.
Yeah, really. And like, as far as proxy war goes, I mean, I guess it's a proxy war in the sense that the American War of Independence was a proxy war between the British and the French. Like, Ukraine winning definitely serves America's national interest, but we don't control them. They're not our puppet.
Yeah. So, how many times in history have there ever been wars that could not be considered quote-unquote proxy wars?
Legit. Yeah, like always some outside power is going to take geopolitical interest in what's happening.
Yeah.
That's just part of international relations.
Understanding this conflict. Many people trace the origins of the war to the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which overthrew the pro-Russian government of Ukraine and installed a pro-NATO one.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Okay, a quick note.
But the origins of this conflict actually...
Yes.
It was not the NATO Maidan. Like, the main goal of that movement was to join the EU, because the government at that time backed out overnight out of an agreement that they had promised to sign as part of their election campaign. And even after the Maidan was successful, the new interim government reassured Russia that it wasn't going to join NATO. And it was only after Russia had seized Ukrainian territory that spring that the Ukrainian parliament revoked its neutrality.
Yeah, let me check. Let me check. So you're saying that I mean, we could potentially just look up the Euromaidan protests in general. Yeah. I mean, I know Wikipedia is not the greatest source in the world, but
it gets you the basic facts. And
yeah,
it gets you decent sources in most cases.
Yeah, so it's interesting that like a lot of it's interesting that supported by the United States was not on here.
Literally, yeah. Like, I mean, John McCain giving a speech, giving moral support does not mean that the U.S. was puppet mastering the movement.
John McCain giving support, like, that's like to say, it's like the equivalent example. Like, you've seen like China give like speeches in support of Palestine, but does that mean that
they don't
China
really do
is the master behind the Israel-Gaza war? Yeah, so that's an example. Like, it's because somebody, politicians. The only way to say this, politicians don't exactly keep a lot of promises they make.
Yeah, and like what they say in a given circumstance does not indicate a broad conspiracy.
It genuinely did not support it.
We'll probably get to more information about that later in the video.
And the demonstrations began on the night of November 21st when protests erupted in the capital, Kyiv. The protests were launched following the Ukrainian government's suspension of preparations for signing the Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement. Now, I do wonder what this does. It establishes a political and economic association between the parties. So basically, it integrated Ukraine closer with the EU.
Yeah, an association agreement is usually the first step towards joining the EU. The other Eastern European countries mostly signed them in the early mid-90s.
Okay. So basically, you're saying that like Ukraine, but they didn't actually want to join NATO. They wanted to join the European
wasn't on the
Union.
agenda and hadn't been on the agenda for 4 years by the time this had happened. So,
but doesn't the European Union have military?
It has, but like that, their defense clause is not taken as seriously as NATO's.
What's an example of this? Has an EU country ever been attacked before? Or?
No, but like Russia has indicated quietly that it doesn't see the European defense clause as quite the same as NATO's Article 5.
Okay, so like
it's not quite. So no, they do not see it as equivalent.
So you're saying that so you're saying that Russia, you're saying that like is there like any evidence of this, or do you just not have it with you? Like,
I mean, there is. It's pretty easy enough to find.
Like, what's an example of like Russia saying that they don't see the EU defense clause as being important?
Let's see.
Oh wait, whoops! I still put the stream on Maidan. Whoops! I don't think I ever got off a Google search, but yeah.
But yeah, no, it's like again, Russia has indicated that the EU defense clause is not quite the same as NATO's Article 5, and they do not see the EU as a military threat. So
can I have the can you put the evidence of this in the stream, just for the record?
I read about it a while ago. Might take some time to find it. So
okay, well, you just go ahead and find that. I would like that. I want that thrown in at some point, just because like I don't want to just talk without evidence. So. All right, well,
All right, well, we'll find it at some point, but let's get back
Okay,
to
cool.
We go all the way back to the Cold.
So the point here is that Russia did not really concern itself with what Ukraine was doing during Euromaidan, like at the time.
No. I mean, they very much opposed Ukraine joining the EU because it would have meant Ukraine leaving the Russian sphere of influence, which that's why they pressured the Ukrainian government out of signing the agreement. But yeah, it wasn't because of any kind of threat from NATO or any other military alliance.
And basically, the point is that Ukraine was not trying to join NATO; they were trying to join the European Union, which Russia itself does not see as a military threat, only an economic threat.
Oh yeah, only geopolitical threat in terms.
You're saying that Russia. So you're saying that like the whole point is that Russia never believed that Ukraine was getting ready to join NATO and invade Moscow.
No, certainly not in 2014.
That's the point. Like Ukraine only just wanted an economic association with the European Union, which challenged Russia's economic power in the region. So like,
yeah, that's why it happened.
Yeah.
War. We cannot understand this war without looking at the whole story from past to present. In this video, you'll see the full picture of the Russia-Ukraine war, and ultimately, who's really to blame. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 after practically all of its constituent republics declared independence. Russia was one of these countries, turning over a new leaf from the Soviet system and ready to try something new. Leadership of the new Russia was taken up by Russian politician Boris Yeltsin, who would lead the country from 1991 to 1999. Yeltsin had a vision: to pursue friendly relations with the US and end hostilities with NATO. Yeltsin believed that under his leadership, Russia would be welcomed with open arms by the Western world. He thought this would lead to a new age of prosperity in Russia. But reality ended up being extremely different from Yeltsin's vision. The dissolution of the Soviet Union left Russia in an extremely weak diplomatic and economic position. In 1992, the Russian Jewish politician Yegor Gadar became prime minister. He pledged to...
Why does he mention that he was Jewish?
I think we both can guess why. It's anti-Semitism, and also, like, it's not even firmly established whether Yegor Gaidar was Jewish in terms of his actual ancestry.
Yeah.
Like, you hear records of both sides, and so, yeah, but, like, he's very clearly taking one of those, and his Judaism, if it existed, was not relevant to what happened here.
And then, so you're saying, yeah, that's probably fair. Him being Jewish is not relevant because, like, he's not
really
like,
not.
what do you mean? He was connected to, like, the American, like, he was still, like, he was, like, there's no evidence to say that he was not, like, pro-Russia as anyone else would be.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's just total anti-Semitism. Okay, let's keep going.
But I just want to see. I do want to look. So, yeah, there's not really much evidence of this guy being Jewish.
Yeah, that's what I said. There's, it's very unlikely and only through anecdotes.
Yeah.
To improve the Russian economy through a mass economic privatization policy known as shock therapy. Russia's state industries and social programs were to be rapidly liquidated and sold to the highest bidder. This plan was endorsed by the International Monetary Fund, the US Treasury, and the Clinton administration. As shock therapy was implemented, Western financiers and oligarchs with ties to organized crime used international banking loans to buy out Russian companies at dirt cheap prices. At the same time, Russia was undergoing inflation that depressed the wealth of native Russians, meaning they couldn't realistically compete for shares of the pie. As a result, many today call this period the looting of Russia. Not only did shock therapy fail to improve the Russian economy, Russia entered a full-blown state of crisis. In the 1990s under Yeltsin, Gaidar, and other American-supported politicians, Russia's industrial production and national income declined by half. The price of goods skyrocketed, and millions of Russians lost their savings due to out-of-control inflation. This economic crisis came with social crisis. Drug abuse, prostitution, and crime rose to record levels. Simultaneously, life expectancy collapsed to new lows. The doom spiral got even worse in 1994 when terrorists and separatists in the region of
Yes?
A word about shock
No,
therapy.
well, yeah, start with shock therapy, yeah. So I'm gonna add John to the stage real quickly. Just give me a minute. Hello, how you doing? We're talking about the war. We're just trying to stay on topic. If you're anything, I just gotta add you on.
All right.
So yeah, go ahead, Sensei.
So Russia wasn't the only country to implement shock therapy, and
all of Eastern Europe did.
Because the problem was, although they undertook all the necessary steps from the program that the IMF recommended, they did not stabilize their economy as they were doing this. Like the central bank, which was under the control of the parliament at this time, which was itself controlled by pro-communist opposition forces, kept printing endless money to subsidize unproductive industries that just made everything worse. Like none of these programs would have worked if the economy wasn't stabilized, as it was, we'll get to, in neighboring Poland. And another issue
the thing is that Poland. The thing is that Poland also did shock therapy, and it worked way better than Russia.
Yeah, like
regardless of your opinion on economics, it is true that Poland had all of the same issues as Russia in the 90s, and yet they seemed to bounce back a lot easier than Russia.
Right, and part of it was in Poland they focused a lot more on developing new private businesses rather than just privatizing the old ones like mad.
Yeah.
The thing is, a lack of the rule of law in Russia led to insider deals where former communists ended up with most of the major assets.
And also, I would guess like Western countries as well.
Yes.
But also the thing is that like Poland. But also the thing is that like if Russia had simply focused on developing new businesses as opposed to propping up old ones, it wouldn't have been like they would have had a much like the communist oligarchs in like the Western countries would have had a way harder time buying out like new businesses that were starting up as opposed to old ones that were already like fledgling.
Right. And it was through this that Poland was able to start growing pretty soon after the initial collapse, because like every post-communist country was going to suffer some kind of recession and associated social impacts in the early 90s because
because you're changing the economic system
in a market economy.
Yeah, like the people like changing an economic system is not like playing like Hearts of Iron 4 or whatever. Like you have to actually like there's a lot of stuff that you have to like fundamentally change about your country. Any economic system change.
Yes, that was the issue. And if you're interested, I have something to read through right here about Russia's economic transformation in the 90s.
Why don't you put it in like the text chat?
You want me to put it in the?
I'll put it in YouTube as a source.
Yeah, so I'll just put it in the chat right here. So, yes. Right, so yeah. You'll be able to read through that later. It's a better explanation. It also deals with a lot of the myths that this video talks about. It's a very useful resource. It's from a Chatham House.
A lot of these arguments came from the left, though.
Yeah, and it's bizarre. It's one of the great paradoxes that the online right also adopt them. It's the horseshoe theory in action.
Yeah, this is very much a left. It's like shock therapy is very much like a leftist argument.
Yeah, no. Though, as we've seen here, it can be appropriated towards anti-Semitic ends as well.
Or just anti-West.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna continue on with this video.
Let's go on.
Chechnya launched an independence war that killed thousands. You may have seen this meme that states many negative statistics about Russia. This is actually citing statistics from the 1990s, many of which have drastically improved in Russia since then.
Okay,
this meme is deliberately meant to mislead.
Let's do research on some of these. All right, let's look up recent.
All right,
data.
can you DM me the data for this so we can put it?
Yeah,
in
as we find this, I will send it to you. But by recent information, Russia has a lower church attendance rate than the Netherlands. I mean, it is.
You mean by that the people actually consistently attending church?
Yeah, not just identify as a Christian for political reasons.
I see.
Which, I mean, is common in Russia. Like, Orthodoxy is in many ways treated similarly to Russian nationalism, treated as part of Russian nationalism.
So, like, a lot of people, like, they identify as Orthodox, but they're not really Orthodox?
Well, yeah, or like they don't really attend church, they're Russian and therefore Orthodox. Let me see. I am trying to send the link. It's a Pew Research survey. But I'll just, for the time being, send this. This is from 2019, and it reveals that only 6% of the population of Russia attends church regularly and 43% of believers. So it's actually lower. Now, let's see the Russian divorce rate.
Could you DM me these statistics?
No, I'm sending you these.
Okay. The point is, like, Russia is not as traditional as it's made out to be.
It is absolutely not. I mean... Here's one from 2024. Russia remains among the highest rates of divorce in the world. And let's see. And here, I will now send an article showing that Russia has the highest rate of orphans in Europe. And it's actually been growing in recent years. That is from 2024. And here, let's find Russia's abortion rate.
Yeah. To be fair, like, is there also any, like, do you think that Putin has, made Russians, like, more traditional or not? Like, is there any evidence?
That's what people like this guy insist, but there's not much evidence of that. As we've seen, Russia retains the highest rates of these things in Europe, and most of them are only slightly improved, if at all, even from the 90s.
Yeah. Are you how long? Oh yeah. Are you gonna DM me all these or?
Yeah, I've sent all of these in the private chat.
Yeah, he sent it in the StreamYard chat.
Oh, in a StreamYard chat. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I'll ask for them later.
People about modern Russia, but nevertheless, it does show how rough the 1990s in Russia were. By 1996, the Russian Jewish oligarch Boris Berezovsky openly boasted.
Once again, referring to him as Jewish.
Again, there's really no reason to bring up his Jewish background. It's not relevant. He never identified as anything other than Russian.
All right.
In an interview that he and 6 other bankers controlled over 50% of the Russian economy and most of the country's mass media. The term the 7 bankers became popular across Russia as symbolic of the Yeltsin government's corruption. The US ambassador to Russia, William Burns, wrote in a letter in 1994, "Winter in Russia is not a time for optimists, and in some respects the popular mood here mirrors the descending gloom. Born of a mood of national regret over the loss of superpower status and an equally acute sense that the West is taking advantage of Russia's weakness." By the late 1990s, a new rift emerged in American-Russian relations: NATO's eastward expansion. Starting in 1999, Eastern European countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary all joined the NATO alliance. This was widely seen in Russia as America reneging on its promise not to expand NATO eastward. This promise was made during negotiations in 1990 over the reunification of Germany. Transcripts of the meetings in Moscow at the time show that US Secretary of State James Baker told Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that there would be ironclad guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. The article.
Ready to correct him on that?
Ready, and I'm just sending an article actually from Lithuania's state broadcaster of all things, refuting this exactly.
Where is the private chat on StreamYard? Oh, there it is. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you've seen a bunch of stuff I've sent there. Anyway, so for starters, there was no binding agreement not to expand NATO into Eastern Europe.
Let's have a look at this article.
Yeah, let's look at it. But I can summarize the basic points. Basically, there were only such an agreement in the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, that NATO forces would not deploy on the territory of the former East Germany, and that has been upheld to this day. There were only vague hints that other Eastern European countries could possibly be excluded from NATO membership as part of this negotiation process. They were not legally binding. They were not made by someone with the authority to make such a legally binding statement.
It was kind of like an executive
no longer
agreement.
Exists, right? People thought that the Soviet Union would continue to exist for the foreseeable future, albeit weakened. And there were still Soviet troops in these countries, so NATO expansion wasn't really on the agenda when any of this was said. And of course, when NATO committed to admitting Eastern European countries in 1995, the situation had changed drastically.
Yeah. So you're saying it's simply like, because that's the thing about history. A lot of agreements are made under very specific circumstances, and when circumstances change, those agreements generally tend to be broken. I would say Russia could have a lot to say about that, but
they're no longer. But again, these circumstances are no longer applicable. They were made at a snapshot moment in history when the Eastern European communist regimes had fallen, but Germany had not yet reunified, and the Soviet Union still existed, and they were said in the circumstances of that time.
Oh, I just got a message from Grayson. I think we'll be able to get him on.
Awesome.
All right, let's see if he joins. Let's look at this. So, in 1990, the question about whether a reunified Germany could be part of NATO were raised. West Germany is since 1955. The Soviet Union collapsed a year later, but an agreement between NATO and Russian military bloc would not expand east is a myth. This is a myth. To start with, there is no promise, any form or treaty document that NATO countries make the Soviet Union or Russia. According to him, if there's a formal agreement, Putin and other Russian politicians would be able to refer to it directly when talking about NATO expansion. In other words, Arguments invoking alleged agreement of NATO are made up by Putin, as his predecessor Boris Yeltsin never said anything like that. If we look at various historical documents and so on, we see that the issue of NATO expansion to the east was not even mentioned. When Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO in 1999, there was no objection from Yeltsin or Russia. It was only after Lithuania and the other Baltic countries joined NATO that Putin started to say there was such agreement, and there was a threat to Russia.
And here's the crucial bit. It was made to the USSR, not to modern Russia.
Yeah. To be fair, you could consider Russia the successor state to the modern USSR, which the West did at the time because we gave them Ukraine's nukes.
Right, but in terms of power and the threat at the time, the Soviets were much different.
Yeah. But the point is that at the time, like, to be fair, like, you know, like when the treaty was made, the U.S. was assuming the Soviet Union would not have collapsed. And
right,
obviously, like the circumstances around the treaty changed.
They could have used, at least from our perspective, there was the real fear of a renewed crackdown on Eastern Europe from the troops that were still there. So, of course, talking about NATO membership at that point would have not been practical and might have been dangerous.
Yeah. I also think it was like a pragmatic promise made at the time to try and curtail the hardliners in the USSR.
It was because like that was the terminal crisis of the Soviet Union in hindsight. That's when it was really starting to fall apart, and we didn't know it at the time, but we did see that there was a risk of hardliners taking over, which, remember, they ultimately attempted to do in August of 91.
Yeah. That's the thing. And so the thing is, if anything, this whole promise was actually a failed attempt by the West to keep the USSR intact.
It was, and also to preserve the democratic reforms that had been ongoing there for the last few years, and basically to save Gorbachev from a counter-revolutionary coup from Soviet hardliners.
Yeah, I see. So, if anything, this whole agreement, as opposed to NATO making this they later as opposed to NATO making a promise they later broke, what happened is that NATO made a non-legally binding promise in hopes of keeping the USSR together, and then when that failed, they were like, "Oh yeah, might as well get the Eastern Europe into NATO."
Basically, and Eastern Europe pushed for that the moment they had the opportunity. Right? Again, all these critiques of so-called NATO expansion forget that the impetus came from Eastern Europe itself. It wasn't some imperialist expansion by the U.S.
Yeah, it wasn't. Well, that's not to say, obviously the U.S. would want these countries in NATO, but it's not like we need these countries in NATO.
Yeah. It's, again, and the point was stability in Europe and safeguarding their democratic development, which the military security that NATO provided was supposed to help with, and it did, according to studies.
Oh, okay. Oh wait, no, I don't need to do that. Sorry, I'm playing the game. Yeah. So it's like the whole the whole idea. So like NATO never made an ironclad promise that the NATO
would never expand.
It just didn't happen, like straight up. All right, so I think we're gonna move on from here.
All right, let's keep going.
NATO expansion, what Gorbachev heard from George Washington University says, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO's expansion was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev. Discussions of NATO in the context of German unification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memcons and telcons at the highest levels. To put it simply, American and NATO officials did tell Soviet officials that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. However, when America was in a stronger position, this promise disappeared. NATO apologists often defend these actions by claiming that there was never an agreement in writing on NATO's expansion eastward, But this ignores the fact that America had deliberately misled and taken advantage of Russia's trust, acting in bad faith and damaging American-Russian relations.
Well, we've been over this.
But America wasn't betting on the Soviet Union collapsing at the time.
We literally weren't. Yeah.
He's acting as if America intentionally caused the USSR to fall so they could later on break these promises. Which is not what happened.
It's like nobody in 1990 was secretly planning to stab the Russians in the back over these agreements, because we didn't really think that NATO expansion would even be much of an issue going forward.
Yeah. If anything, in the 90s, a lot of politicians, and I think Bush Sr. was, called running this, and I know the late Henry Kissinger also believed this. A lot of American politicians at the time actually wanted a strong Russia, just one that was allied with the West.
Yeah, and which was a democracy. That's the thing. We had no objection to the existence of Russia as it was.
Yeah. I just, a lot of people have this idea that the United States has this psychological need to be the strongest country in the world, or they just completely lose their mind.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. It's cartoon villain narrative of geopolitics. And
it's like, the thing is that well, that is always certainly true that Americans really like our hegemony. That doesn't necessarily mean we are not that America. The idea that America's never had an agreement that mutually, but if America were truly like this, why, for example, did we open up trade with China? And to be fair, that was a counterweight to the USSR at the time. But the fact that we even, because at the time we opened up trade with China because we thought that if we allowed them to develop, that they would become our ally.
Yeah, that was the hope.
Ended up being naive, but that's ended up what happened.
And it goes to show that states don't essentially have foreign policies. Certain governments do, and those can change given the circumstances.
Yeah. Those also mention the fact that you also have to mention the fact that the people that made now this is in my opinion an actual flaw of democracy, but the people that made the promises to Russia to not expand were not of the same political party as the ones who actually invited Eastern Europe into NATO, because the people that made these promises were in the Bush Sr. administration, and the Clinton administration was the people that actually invited Eastern Europe into NATO.
Right. And ironically enough, one of the motivations for that was Eastern European leaders actually threatened to a campaign with Republicans in that year's election. It was actually kind of funny.
Yeah. But then again, it is fair that the Republicans did support Eastern Europe joining NATO, and they're actually, because at the time the Republicans were the more hawkish party. This was the 90s.
Yeah, and it's
they were actually the bigger supporter of, Eastern European NATO expansion. But then again, the people that made the promises to Russia were almost certainly not the same people who greenlighted Eastern Europe into NATO.
Yeah, it was a different administration.
That's not to mention the fact that the U.S. is not even the only country in NATO.
Yeah, remember, countries have to get the approval of every existing member to join. Finland and Sweden were famously held up by Turkey and Hungary for a year.
Yeah. But then again, it's not So yeah, it's to say, we had, in order to get Eastern Europe into NATO, we not only had to have the approval of the United States, we also have to have the approval of every single member in NATO.
So yeah, it's and the French and Germans famously vetoed Ukraine's membership down the line, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
Saying that you're only as good as your word, and America had broken theirs. Russia may have taken the expansion of NATO more lightly if it weren't for another major event in 1999. the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia.
The first bombing of its kind in NATO history. On March 24, 1999, Western nations carried out their threat against Serbia and began the biggest military conflict on Serbian soil since World War II.
This was the first time NATO used military force without the approval of the UN Security Council, and thus international legal approval. This showed that NATO would operate not only as a defensive alliance, but an offensive alliance that had no problem bombing sovereign states it disapproved of. Russia observed all of this and never forgot it. Even the famous Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn decried the action, saying, "NATO has proclaimed to the whole world, might is right. Those who are strong are always right." He added that it was the destruction of a beautiful country in full view of humanity, while civilized governments applaud this. Not only Russia, but many countries across the world opposed these actions by NATO. It was a serious departure from what NATO claimed to stand for, and people would not quickly forget this.
Okay, so for starters,
as Russia was real NATO.
That war was a response to the Serbian government's ethnic cleansing of its own people, which threatened to create a refugee crisis that would threaten neighboring states, including NATO members, especially the new ones, like Hungary, which were admitted just that year. It was not some unprovoked aggression just to stick the finger up at Russia.
Oh yeah, also have to mention, what's also funny about this is the fact that Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union historically didn't exactly get along.
No, they were famously at odds during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And
Stalin, I think, was trying to kill Tito, I believe.
Tito, yeah. Stalin was trying to kill Tito. The point is that, like, the Soviets and Yugoslavia were never really friends.
Yeah, even after.
I do understand why Russia, would be upset by the bombing of Serbia, just because, a country in our backyard is getting bombed by NATO and all that. But, like, then again, at the same time, it's like, do you really think Russia, like, actively felt threatened by the bombing of the Yugoslavia? I mean, they probably did to an extent, but, like,
Right, and again, the humiliation was mostly that this happened in a country that had been allied with Russia in the past, and there was nothing Russia could do about it. It was just great power chauvinism.
Yeah, so you're saying the Russians were simply just not happy about the fact that, like, they couldn't, like, do anything about the fact that NATO was bombing Serbia. They were not even, really unhappy about the fact.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think the Yugoslav Wars is too relevant to this. I think we all have our opinions on that, so I'm just going to move on.
As Russia was reeling from the 1990s chaos, in the year 2000, Vladimir Putin became president of the country. Putin began implementing policies very different from his predecessor Yeltsin. He led economic and criminal reforms, including a crackdown against many of the worst oligarchs who had looted Russia in the 90s.
What's funny is that Putin was Yeltsin's handpicked successor.
He was. And as far as prosecuting of oligarchs went, it was only a few who stuck their heads up against him.
Hold it. Grayson's doing. Oh, hi, Grayson. How you doing?
Here for a while.
Welcome.
Hey. Yeah, don't ask about the Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah. No, to say this, we're talking about the fact that, like, Putin was Boris Yeltsin's hand-picked successor. So he makes it as if Putin just gave Yeltsin the middle finger. Like, not really.
And early in Putin's reign, he even implemented some pro-market reforms, like the flat tax and the like, and officially allowing private property. But Russia only officially permitted that in 2001. So it wasn't really that radical a break early on.
Yeah. So you're saying that, like, when Putin first, you're saying that Putin was, like, nowhere less capitalist than Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah, I mean, at least in his first term. And he mentioned, he cracked down on the oligarchs, and no, people like Roman Abramovich, Alisher Usmanov, Vladimir Potanin, those people who had been some of the most malevolent actors of the 1990s chaos were still allowed to keep their wealth and still allowed to play a major role.
Well, also a lot.
They didn't challenge the new government.
I know a lot of like Western governments, when Putin took the power, initially thought he would be a easier person to work with than Yeltsin.
Yeah, because to be fair, wasn't Yeltsin like a big drunk, and he was actually
He had a lot of like personal flaws, and so people thought Putin would be most suitable for the roles of government.
Yeah, so you're saying because so you're saying the West actually disliked Boris Yeltsin and thought that he was a problematic leader.
Well, no, because Boris Yeltsin in the West had a lot of issues. It wasn't even just like Yugoslavia. In like the 90s, he accused Estonia of being an apartheid state against ethnic Russians.
Damn.
Yeah, that guy was notoriously really erratic.
Yeah, and of course Putin and this is before the Communist Party of Russia was like essentially muddled, but people were also more concerned about a communist rise in Russia than they were.
Yeah, they were a serious threat, and their leader was like a hardcore neo-Stalinist. So people were genuinely concerned that they would return to power.
Yeah.
You're saying like at the time the West saw Vladimir Putin as actually better than Yeltsin.
They saw him as more competent.
To the degree he'd bring stability, yes.
Yeah. So that's what contrary makes out to be. The West did not actually want Russia to be the unstable mess that it was in the 90s, and they actually welcomed Russia fixing itself up as opposed to encouraging it, which these people like to say.
Well, yeah. Because an unstable Russia wasn't good for anyone.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is not. Because, contrary, because some people seem to be allergic to this idea, but what helps one country tends to help other countries.
Well, the United States, after the deaths of Dibovik, or whatever his name was, that Chechen leader, after he died and the Chechens went Islamist, the West was more concerned about the Chechens because they had ties to Al-Qaeda, and this was like... we tend not to think about the war on terrorism in the 90s, but it was already going into effect.
Actually it was, because there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in the 90s.
People tend to forget the 90s was actually the start of...
And there were the embassy bombings in East Africa, too.
9/11 was just the
peak of it.
Yeah, the straw that broke the camel's back, but
but
it was already a thing.
Yeah. So again, the point is America at the time actually wanted a strong Russia because the strong Russia would crack down on Chechnya, who was connected to Islamic terrorism.
Crack down on Islamists and neo-communists, and also make sure the nukes were being properly
dealt
removed.
away with.
Yeah. Because at the time, if you were on the left, you could actually use this as an argument, the idea that the West, actually did like Vladimir Putin at the time. But you have to acknowledge that, it ended up being misguided.
I don't know if they liked him. I think they just saw him as like a not bad option, which hindsight is like 20.
He was the less bad option at the time.
Yeah. We have to remember the fact that, hindsight's kind of 20/20 at this point.
Yeah.
Boris Berezovsky, who had bought up Russian media outlets during shock therapy and bragged about how his clique of 7 bankers controlled over 50% of the economy, fled Russia to Britain in fear of a criminal investigation. Yegor Gadar, the prime minister architect of shock therapy, fled Russia to Ireland and later Ukraine. Those who didn't or couldn't flee, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had bought majority stakes in Yukos Oil Company during the looting, was thrown in prison for 10 years. Keep in mind he was the richest man in Russia at the time. Putin's crackdown and reversal of shock therapy was the biggest transformation in Russian politics since the fall of the Soviet Union. As the 2000s progressed, the 90s were left...
But as I said before, Putin didn't actually reverse shock therapy.
No, I mean, I don't know if he actually gets into, like, the actual specifics of Putin's economics. Because, obviously, 22 years and 25 years in power, you're going to have different policies. I think at the beginning, he to a degree, carried the Yeltsin.
He continued the market reforms.
Yeah. Because his party at the time was physically conservative. At least claimed to be like centrist and like center-right more.
Yeah, and the turn towards nationalism and revanchism came later, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
Behind, and the Russian economy and standard of living improved. Life expectancy rose, drug and alcohol abuse fell, and the economy of living improved.
It seems like life expectancy only actually started rising in like 2005.
Well, that's
and a lot of this is correlated with the economic recovery, which itself was largely linked to oil and improving in oil prices, which, again, has always been a major factor in Russia's economy.
Yeah,
I mean, like, also, like, of course things would go. It was the late 90s in Russia. There was no place to go but up.
Really?
The one option was up.
Yeah. And the thing is that what's interesting is that, see, Russia, when he says life expectancy goes up, was around Russian life expectancy, according to him, goes up at around 2007. What's interesting is that at the same time, there was a massive increase in oil prices. So through all of this, there was a big increase in oil prices.
And there was a commodities boom in the 2000s.
Drove most of these improvements.
Yeah. You've seen that, like, Russian economy has, like, always, been very dependent on oil.
Yeah, I mean, the discovery of oil in the late 60s probably saved the Soviet regime from premature collapse because it was able to keep them chugging along for a few more years until perestroika.
Yeah, the thing is that in the around the 70s is when, like, the whole belief in the Soviet system started to collapse.
Yeah. And the economy was kept from totally falling apart by oil prices, which collapsed in the second half of the 80s and were a big hamper on Gorbachev's reforms.
Yeah.
Expectancy rose, drug and alcohol abuse fell, and the economy grew. President Putin enjoyed enormous political power and an approval rating of over 80%.
LOL! Source. Trust me, bro. Not to mention the fact that every single Eastern European country had an economic recovery. And it's even certainly to say that the ones allied to the West definitely had a much better economic recovery than the ones that are not.
Literally. Yeah.
Like, every single Eastern European country has had an economic recovery, but, like, I think you guys could tell me whether you'd rather live in Poland or rather live in Russia.
No, yeah, that's the thing. Literally every EU member country, every former communist country that joined the EU is doing better than Russia, even like Bulgaria. And that was a big factor of why Ukraine itself would ultimately seek membership, which we'll get to later in this video.
It's really the fact that Ukraine saw, like, because, like, the thing, because, like, what's interesting is that, like, from what I understand, during the Soviet times, Poland was the poorest country in the entire communist bloc.
One of the poorest at least, and now it's the richest in the former communist bloc.
Well, actually, the Baltic states and Czech Republic and Slovenia are better off.
Well, yeah, there depends on the metric you use, and there are plenty of competitors.
Yeah. But the thing is that Poland went from, like, the absolute bottom of the barrel in Eastern European income to, like, the upper echelon of Eastern European income just by,
also, I think,
getting out of the Russian sphere of influence.
I think, like, Kazakhstan now has, like, is, like, almost IOO has surpassed Russian
Yeah.
per capita GDP.
And
And then again,
Kazakhstan is also
Kazakhstan-
a petrostate. Remember?
Yeah.
Kazakhstan also has uranium as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is also very important. So, Kazakhstan has a combination of. Well, the thing is that natural resources are interesting because, sometimes you have countries with plentiful natural resources that are absolutely in a state of chaos and complete ineptitude, like the Congo, and then you have states like Norway or Kazakhstan that they have not a lot of, or even Australia, that are very dependent on natural resources, but are it's still incredibly stable. So, the whole relationship of natural resources to a country is very interesting.
It's ambiguous. It can be
write
a
ton of papers on it, like
Venezuela famously has alternated between wealth and total ruin depending on the price of oil.
Yeah. But yeah, and again, as a country, Norway has oil. Norway has oil, obviously very important, and it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Well, again, countries like the Congo have they have cobalt, which is obviously very important, and they're a complete mess. So the whole relationship of natural resources and economic success, you can write a bunch of papers on that, and so. This is not something we're going to be able to cover, but it's just something to say. I think Russia's kind of in the middle. I think, Russia's kind of doing okay economically for a country dependent on a natural resource, but compared to other Eastern European countries, they're not doing as well. And you have to consider the fact that Russia, you would think they'd have advantages over these other countries, being the center of the former Soviet Union and being where all the wealth is concentrated. You'd expect them to, have the advantage in economic power as opposed to countries like Poland or Czech Republic or whatever. But even then, they're falling behind.
Right. Russia's tail is consistently one of a lot of potential wasted by corruption and authoritarianism.
I honestly argue it's been like that since the Bolshevik Revolution. I get that we all have our opinions on this, so I'm not gonna go into whether the Russian Empire was good or bad. That's not the topic of the video.
Yeah. Point being, it wasn't because of some of Putin's magic or whatever.
No, it was not.
You might think that American politicians would be happy that a country in chaos, suffering immense hardship, had successfully recovered itself, but it was the opposite. Despite these successes, distrust between the United States government and Russia only grew. When a new Chechen separatist war broke out in August 1999, the American state openly supported the rebels. The foreign minister of the Chechen separatists, the U.S. Secretary...
No, he did not. Okay, that's just plain
That's
wrong.
not true. We didn't do it at all. After 9/11, they even spun it as part of the war on terror. Russia actually let the U.S. use their bases in Central Asia to invade Afghanistan. We actually got along pretty well at that time.
Yeah, you have to remember the fact that Chechnya at the time had a large Islamist population, and America's biggest enemy at the time was radical Islam. So you have to remember that alone means there's no way in hell the Americans would have supported Chechnya at any form.
Absolutely not. And we were still trying to build good relations with Russia at that time. Bush famously went to Moscow and said, "Oh, I looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul."
Yeah, so the point is the idea that America did not support Chechnya in this war.
Yeah, that's just ridiculous.
Distrust between the United States government and Russia only grew. When a new Chechen separatist war broke out in August 1999, the American state openly supported the rebels. The foreign minister of the Chechen separatists, Ilyas Akhmedov, was allowed to visit the U.S. State Department. But even with this American support, Russia successfully put down the revolt and reincorporated Chechnya as part of Russia. It was a major military victory for Putin, and only increased his popularity. Now, let's quickly
Hold
review.
on,
In
I
the
gotta
decade
say that
after the
name
Soviet
again.
It was a major military victory because Yeltsin lost to Chechnya because
Yeah.
the Russian military was a complete mess.
I need to see what name of that guy who he mentioned.
Ilyas Akhmadov.
All right, so I'm looking this up. That's not it. I'll look it up later. What? Actually, could just go back to the name. I just need to.
Oh yeah, the truth is the U.S. did not arm the Chechen separatists, and this guy was going to Western capitals in a desperate plea for support that ultimately never came.
Oh, okay. So you're saying
he visited actually before the beginning of the Second Chechen War.
You're saying that he visited Washington D.C. for support, but
yeah, no, I mean, it was during the war, but he was trying
He appealed to
unsuccessfully
the
get support.
UN, the PAC, the European Parliament, U.S. Congress, International.
Yeah.
He tried to appeal to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he didn't get the support he needed.
By this logic, America supports Palestine because they appealed to American
because the Palestinian president has appeared in the U.S. on multiple occasions.
And the only reason Ilyas Akhmadov was given asylum in the U.S. after the war was because he was seen as more moderate than the other Chechen rebels because he made statements that was against suicide bombings.
Oh, okay. So he was given because we have to remember the fact that America, so you're saying that he wasn't seen as part of the radical Islamists, which means America...
Yeah, he wasn't seen as the radicals like other Chechens were, and he wasn't as radical as they were. He was, because people don't forget, even though it was a majority Islamist movement, not everyone who was involved in it was just an Islamist by default.
As you're saying, but Americans in general were very, Americans did not support Chechnya as a country at the time.
No, it was not a supported thing.
If anything, it was the opposite. We were very wary of Chechnya.
At best, we might have had some trust in this guy, and that failed.
Yeah.
They're simply saying, no, it's not true. America did not support.
Yeah, it doesn't indicate that we supported their movement.
Yeah, no.
All right.
Alrighty.
Separatists, Ilyas Akhmadov, was allowed to visit the U.S. State Department. But even with this American support, Russia successfully put down the revolt and reincorporated Chechnya as part of Russia.
Actually,
it was a major military victory for Putin and only increased his popularity. Now, let's quickly review. In the decade after the Soviet Union collapsed, America had...
Okay, we could pretty much skip this part because we've already gone over...
Yeah, we've been over
all of this part, so we're just going to skip the unnecessary parts of the video.
Throughout the 2000s, a new trend began to emerge in Eastern Europe. America backing so-called color revolutions across the region. One of the first of these color revolutions occurred in none other than Ukraine in 2004. This revolution was known as the Orange Revolution. Its goal was to topple the pro-Russian government at the time and install a pro-NATO one. Does that sound familiar? Sources like The Guardian note in 2004, the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that, in 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. The Guardian was writing in favor of these color revolutions, but in doing so admitted that they're creations of the American government and are used to topple governments it doesn't like. Nevertheless, in 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine succeeded in bringing the pro-NATO Viktor Yushchenko to power for 5 years. The success of the Orange Revolution set the precedent for future regime change in Ukraine. But that wasn't all. In 2003,
Okay, let's stick it to Ukraine for now, and then we'll talk about the Georgia thing right after.
So again, none of these color revolution theorists can accurately point to what exactly the U.S. did to justify calling these movements U.S. puppets. Like, did we pay protesters? Did we fund? Did we send CIA agents to stir up chaos? Because the closest thing they can point to is some NGOs that helped organize protests might have received some money from some entities linked to the U.S. government. And the amount of money they receive in total is usually just totally peanuts. It's in the mid six-figure range. Like, you think you can overthrow a government with that? No. Like,
that's absurd, especially now in a country, especially Ukraine, a country that's like a $500 billion GDP, and
yeah, it's absolutely tiny compared to the proportion of
when they did the election in like 2005, when they did 2004, when they redid the election, Yushchenko won by like 52 to like 45.
Yeah, that's
so
the thing.
It was a
pretty decisive margin, and it was, according to the exit polls of the canceled first try of the second round, that was basically the margin. And there was pretty conclusive, like, it was almost insane evidence of voter fraud. Like, they used disappearing ink in neighborhoods known to support Yushchenko. It was pretty dirty, and it was rightfully overturned, and they tried again. And the Supreme Court of Ukraine did this. The United States does not control them.
So you're saying that this was a Ukrainian... You're saying that, like, contrary to what things have to be, the Ukrainians themselves actively got rid of a corrupt leader, and this had nothing to do with the United States.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so, like, the whole evidence is, like, it's like, I don't know, say, sometimes, like, this applies to leftists too, but, like, sometimes these types of people are literally, like, the biggest American exceptionalists on earth, as they essentially believe America can literally do anything in the world if it wants.
Yeah, like, we can create revolutions on demand in countries the size of Ukraine.
Yeah.
It is an utterly ridiculous worldview.
Also, I think one thing to be pointed out is that I don't really think Kuchma was that pro-Russia either.
Yeah, he was famous for hemming and hawing between the two sides, and as early as 2002, he was applying for membership in NATO, which NATO turned down at that time because of Ukraine's corruption and Kuchma's authoritarianism.
Yeah,
so you're saying that, like, the guy who was overthrown. So you're saying that, like, this was, actively Ukrainian.
No one was overthrown in the Orange Revolution. It was a case of two candidates in a disputed election. Kumcha was just the president at this time, but like no one was actually overthrown in this.
Yeah. They're saying, but the point is that the voting out of Kuchma was like a domestic issue and not a.
Well, yeah, the protest that got the second round of the election to be redone that helped Yushchenko win. Kuchma was actually term limited, so he wasn't running. But Yanukovych was his chosen.
I see. And was Kuchma like pro-West or no?
He was between the two.
Yeah, he famously swayed back and forth.
Yeah, so you're saying that like he wasn't like a pro-Russian politician at all. Like
he wasn't a pro-Russian hardliner, at least.
All right.
Georgian government was also overthrown by a US-backed color revolution known as the Rose Revolution. Like in Ukraine, it threw out a government that was friendly to Russia and installed one that was pro-NATO. Between 2000...
Hello? Hey, hold it.
Wonder what's going on.
I don't know.
Sorry, my dad came in. I'll be sorry. All right, let's move on.
In 2008, the US began arming and training Georgia to engage in war with Russia.
What's the point of all of this? just to train them in the fundamentals of offense and defense.
Big overall question, why? Why is the U.S. actually doing this?
Just to, I don't know why.
Allow me to answer that question for him. They were training the Georgian military to attack Russia. Tensions came to a head in 2008 when
attack Russia.
Oh yeah, that was definitely the plan. Yeah, use a nation that's like small and has like a very token force. Yeah, that was the U.S. plan.
Yeah, pick a fight. Yeah,
you cracked the case, bro. You cracked the case.
Rather than prepare for a possible invasion, which
they didn't put like actual air. Yeah, they were going to pick a fight with Russia, but they also didn't like put any like actual like U.S. assets in the country because
yeah,
they were preparing to fight. They weren't preparing to fight that hard.
You're saying that so the idea that like NATO was they wanted Georgia to invade Russia is like totally ludicrous.
It's insane. It's like absolutely ridiculous.
Also, how did that president of Georgia come in power again? Oh yeah, there was that violent overthrow of the first president of Georgia.
Yeah, the Soviet-era dissident Gamsa, he was toppled in a coup in a civil war. That's how Shevardnadze came to power. And compared to that, the color revolution was perfectly peaceful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Georgian government invaded the pro-Russian separatist region of South Ossetia. Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers, starting a war which Russia decisively won in 5 days. NATO apologists today call this a Russian attack, but the EU investigation into the conflict later concluded that the America-backed Georgian government had started the war. Even the EU concluded that Russia didn't start this conflict. Reuters reported in 2009, Georgia started a war with Russia, a report supported by the EU. As you can imagine, after this debacle between Russia and Georgia, American Russian
shot first, but that they had been baited into doing so by Russian shelling from the South Ossetian enclave before the actual main phase of the war.
I see.
So yeah, it's
relation.
All right, let's move on.
Were at their lowest point since the Cold War. The administrations of George W. Bush and his predecessor Bill Clinton had consistently treated Russia as an adversary. But in 2009, there was a new president taking office. A president who promised hope and change. Maybe this time things would finally be different. Barack Obama came into office in 2009. His administration claimed to want to reset relations with Moscow and put the negative relationship between America and Russia in the past. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and pressed a fake reset button. At face value, this was supposed to signify a new era in American-Russian relations. Hillary Clinton even called it a fresh start. Was this finally the turning point? Sadly, it was not. In actuality, the policy of the Obama administration would be the exact same as every other American administration since 1990. Seeking global domination. America was once again doing diplomacy in bad faith. Future events would prove this, time starting in the Middle East. From 2008 to 2014, America and other NATO countries...
Let's deal with some of the things you just said. First of all, consistently treated Russia as an enemy. No, we gave them shit tons of aid in the 90s. We sent all sorts of advisors to help them save themselves. I mean, even if the advice was bad, the point was still to help them fix their economy. And like during the war on terror, we actually cooperated. We objectively did not treat Russia like an enemy in those first few years. We accepted their aid after 9/11. So no, this is all ridiculous. And like we straight up turned our backs on Russian aggressions in Moldova, Georgia, and Tajikistan.
Well, also Russia was doing like some, like even if you like, are we also just going to pretend that Russia was just like only ever trying to cozy up to the West and was never ever being aggressive with them?
No, it's ridiculous. I mean, they were weak, so like they probably saw that was in their short-term interest, but there were definite plans.
They did passive aggressive. they did like passive aggressive things against the West, like when Putin made that trade deal with Cuba. That was not a direct like threat, but it was like a passive aggressive move.
It was. And so, no, it wasn't just Russia acting in perfectly good faith and the West seeking to sabotage it at every opportunity. No.
Yeah,
and also, the stuff about the pushing the reset button, they genuinely meant that. Like as late as 2012, Obama was laughing at Romney. Oh, the 80s are calling. They want their foreign policy back.
The 80s are calling, and they want their foreign policy back.
Yeah. God, that's so ridiculous.
Yeah, no, it's like that's a very famous, because if I remember correctly, that like that statement was like actually very important in winning Obama the election over Mitt Romney.
Yeah, it played some role, and I think Obama said to Medvedev in a quiet conversation after the election, "I'll be more flexible," something like that.
I'm going to give you some flexibility after the election, Medvedev.
Yeah. So no, this was not bad faith. We genuinely were trying to engage with them, and
yeah,
they would
like,
bite that hand.
Yeah, the point is that it wasn't the Americans. It was this idea that America was constantly praying Russia. Like, no, the evidence points to the opposite. It points to
right.
We were genuinely wanted to ally with Russia, and they many times did not abide by that. All right, so I guess we're gonna move on.
Countries such as the U.
Also, Sensibag, I think you mentioned earlier that the Georgian guy that was overthrown in that revolution that he talks about was not even pro-Russia, and Putin literally supported it at the time.
Yeah, he was not. He tried to build close relations with the West during his reign, and Putin initially didn't care very much that Shevardnadze was overthrown. But he began to believe the conspiracy theory after one of his political spin doctors pitched it to him to explain his own failure to rig the election in Ukraine in favor of Yanukovych.
Okay. So you're saying like Putin at the time, he did not care about this guy in Georgia. He thought okay, whatever, a corrupt pro-West leader was overthrown.
But yeah, he came to care about it much later on.
Yeah. It's kind of funny they had to throw his conspiracy theory around as opposed to literally just pointing to, oh yeah, a pro-West leader that was corrupt was overthrown. Why they have to, instead of just pointing and getting a win off that, they have to spin it into this really over-the-top conspiracy theory. So yeah,
UK and France continued backing color revolutions, toppling governments across the world. Some of the most famous of these were the so-called Arab Spring, where governments in the Arab world were overthrown left and right. One such example was Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, a Russian ally. The rebels opposing him were directly backed by NATO air support, which bombed and sabotaged Libyan state troops. The US and UK governments had long hated Gaddafi and took their chance to kill him. Gaddafi ended up brutally murdered in the streets, and his country descended into complete chaos which continues to present day. The entire country of Libya was destroyed by NATO, again a supposedly defensive alliance. Another country at this time that faced turmoil from US-backed rebels was Syria, which descended into a civil war that also still continues to this day. While all these color revolutions were happening in the 2010s,
before we talk about LGBT stuff, we're going to talk about. I would like to talk about the Middle East for a brief second.
Right. So for starters, these so-called color revolutions didn't just target pro-Russian leaders, but also pro-Western ones, like Mubarak of Egypt. We famously refused to back him at that crucial moment.
Yeah. So you're saying that, the idea that the Arab Spring was this secret plot funded by the CIA is just not true. That the Arab Spring, they targeted leaders that many times were pro-West.
And you could argue whether we should have backed them or not, but they were not a U.S. plot. They just received some moral backing from certain officials as they were unfolding.
Yeah.
And the Libyan intervention, fun fact, was actually authorized by the UN. They in the Arab League, they straight up authorized NATO to get involved to protect civilians from Gaddafi.
It's something that I think Russia could have blocked.
Yeah, like Medvedev famously did not use his UN veto to stop this operation, and this ran contrary to Putin's wishes, and that's why Medvedev was ultimately pushed aside.
Yeah, but then again, you could still argue the fact that Medvedev just screwed the pooch with this. You know, if you're a Russia supporter, you'd simply argue that Medvedev screwed the pooch. So that's not necessarily a bad argument to make if you were on that side.
Right, but still, he could have done it, and he chose not to, and that's on them.
Yeah.
And then in I think August during the Civil War, the Russian government recognized the NTC in Libya. So
yeah, before Gaddafi was even overthrown. So that's kind of a non-issue here.
All right, so I think we're going to continue on. We don't need to talk too much about the Middle East here.
Another rift emerged between Russia and America-aligned countries. Large cultural differences grew on issues such as family values, Christianity, and LGBT. Between 2000 and 2020, Western countries liberalized social laws across the board. Gay marriage, gay adoption, you name it. America also became the pornography capital of the world, producing more porn than any other country and
oh my god.
I do not think LGBT issues have as much to do with foreign policy as
and like he mentions like Christian. It's like, what do you think most of the what do you think the Great Schism was about?
I mean, come on.
That's the entire reason Russia and Western Europe had terrible relationship for 1,000 years. Was the Great Schism?
Yeah, no, but it's also not to mention the fact that there's no reason. There's how is LGBT stuff how is an American domestic issue the source of the tension between America and Russia? I don't really think LGBT.
It really is not. To do with it. And I don't think this guy wants to look up porn and prostitution in Russia, and I think he'd be disappointed.
Yeah. I say America.
Honestly, the only reason why America has so much well, for one, it's not a per capita breakdown; it's just a raw numbers breakdown. And yeah, America being the third largest country in terms of population, and not being China, which would have a very large market like that. I mean, but Russia makes up 4% of the pornography of the world, and it is less than 1% of the world population. So it is definitely pushing its weight.
Per capita, it's definitely a big leader. It punches above its weight.
Yeah, lol. Why the fuck would you want to say that when it comes to porn?
Yeah, that.
Yeah, but that's the thing. But it's I don't really think LGBT, being pro or anti-LGBT is the source of America and Russia being rivals. It's especially not the source of Russia's dislike of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's total red herring to bring up LGBT laws in the West.
Yeah, the thing is that I think LGBT laws are generally much more of a domestic issue than a foreign policy issue.
Well, yeah, because we have good relations with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, those guys famously turn the other way when it comes to their laws, right?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia literally opposes the West on everything domestically.
Yeah, but I don't social issues aren't going to be
They are not going to motivate foreign policy.
Yeah,
unless they're like
which is
like extreme. But at that point, like to have social issue, it would have to be like said government endorses like sacrifices to barge or something.
Yeah.
The point is that, like, you know, the average American does not care whether a foreign country supports LGBT people in terms of, like, you know, they would probably care about that if they were traveling to the country and they, you know, if they're, you know, if somebody were LGBT and they're traveling to a country, it's like, okay, yeah, we have to be careful in this country because, you know, they're not going to be friendly to us. But, like, I don't think the American government looks at other countries and says, oh, if you have to support LGBT people in order to support you. That's not really true. And, you know, the whole idea of, like, you know, the LGBT movement in the West only supporting, you know, people that only supporting other countries that support them, not exactly true. Palestine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like about also like the nation that actually makes up the biggest point in terms of like revenue is actually Japan. Big shock, I know, Japan. What a thought that those two would.
Yeah.
But then again, you know, there's like you do have to wonder if the porn in Japan is for foreign or domestic consumption. I don't want to go talking about porn the entire time, but I think it is a question that can be posed. Like,
exactly, and again, this is all a red herring he's bringing up.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's this narrative really doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. Like that's, you know, the general point of this, you know, discussion here. All right, time to move on.
Exporting it. Mass immigration brought America from a 90% white country in the 1950s to a 60% white country in 2020. And today, America is projected to be majority non-white in the 2040s. In Russia, the story was incredibly different.
Russia literally
Is he going to bring up mass migration? Because
Russia has the highest Muslim population in all of Europe. They have an entire region of their country that is openly Islamist. They have mass immigration waves from Central Asia. Like, no. And also, you also have to mention the fact that Russia constantly slanders the West for being racist and constantly, and they actually bragged when they annexed Crimea that there's no way in hell that Ukraine would have ever built a mosque in Crimea.
Well, there's also the whole thing about just like, who cares if like white people. Well, technically, the whole white people being a minority in America thing is already kind of dubious because a lot of Hispanics aren't counted as white in the census.
Yeah.
But like would be counted as white if they lived in like Spain.
Yeah, that is very
that's
fair to say. And you also have to mention the fact that like both, you know, Hispanics in general, I think, you know, both white and non-white are growing like very quickly.
Yeah, that like Hispanics are the big reason why the white, because it's not the black population. It's like Asians and Hispanics.
Yeah. The whole white,
at least in the U.S.
Yeah. So the funny thing is so it's a little bit more complicated than, you know, it's fancy. But like the point is that Russia is not anti-immigration from non-white countries.
It is not. And like Russian nationalists who campaign against Central Asian immigration would be shocked to see that in this video and just see their country presented.
At least like the Russian government themselves, like, you know, the Russians actively brag about, you know, having a lot of diverse people.
Not just Central Asians, but also Africans invited in on dubious visa status to help build their weapons for the war.
Yeah, and also conscripted, but that's not to mention that. But like the point is that like Russians, like, you know, the Russian government, at least, you know, they still accept immigrants from like other countries, from like non-white countries like Central Asia. So like I don't necessarily see a reason why, you know, like a Russian, you know, like why would like Muslim immigration in the West be, you know, the breaking between, you know, Western and Russian relations, especially considering the fact that, a lot of Muslim countries are Russia's best friends, like Assad.
Literally, yeah, and that's not to ignore Russia's general third worldist anti-Western positions. I mean, I don't think the guy even knows about that.
Yeah, no, they actively does not. So the thing is that the idea that Russia cares about, Muslims immigrating into Europe is like kind of absurd. If anything, Russia, they see Muslim immigration, they see all this immigration in Europe as a good thing because it creates a lot of like division and a lot of problems for the governments there, and it weakens them.
Yeah. So they're absolutely going out of their way to encourage these kinds of things, and of course,
also not to mention the fact that as evidence for this, there was a scandal a while back where Russia, Belarus, who was a Russian ally, they took a bunch of immigrants from the Middle East, and they scammed them into immigrating into Poland to destabilize the European Union.
Yeah, they're literally inviting mass migration into Europe.
So the point being is that Russia is not, looking at Europe's immigration status with horror. If anything, they're encouraging it. Yeah. They're making it worse. They're actively trying to use immigrants from these countries as a way to destabilize Europe.
So no, it's again, Russia is not an anti-immigrant country.
No, it is not. Well, so the Russian, domestic politics about immigration are complicated. A lot of Russians don't like immigrants.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the West do.
I think they're getting the point.
All right. Okay. I think it's time to move on.
Right.
Russia strengthened laws against LGBT. Most famously, its landmark 2012 anti-gay propaganda law. This law effectively made gay activism illegal in Russia. LGBT adoption was banned, as well as the production and distribution of pornography. Abortion became more restricted, and the state encouraged ethnic Russians to have more children to protect their demographic future.
Only
in
the
20 years,
Muslim
Russia
majority regions of Russia have
only the Muslim majority of Russia has a higher birth rate. But they also often mention the fact that America, you also have to mention the fact that I'm pretty sure every single country in Europe has tried to increase their fertility rate. I know Poland and Hungary did, and they're pro-West.
Yeah.
I do not believe the United States will care if a foreign country tries to increase their fertility rate. That is a very absurd thing to believe.
You haven't considered the real factor of woke imperialism. The woke emperor comes for us all. Does this make Trump a woke emperor?
No.
Russia will still be a racially European country, unlike America. Furthermore,
here's the funny thing. Okay, so other than the fact that America's not in Europe, so who cares? And most of those minorities are Hispanics, which originate from Spain, so it would still be European.
Yeah. And again, our definition of race is vastly different from theirs.
Yeah, I don't
we would probably consider Muslim minorities in Russia to be European.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, Russians, the thing that it is true that the Muslims in Russia are much different than the Muslims in, Western Europe, The Muslims in Russia are people that have lived there for a long time, more generally assimilated, while the Muslims in Europe, a lot of them, they don't want to assimilate. A lot of them, are affiliated with, radical Islamism.
The Dawa guy,
Yeah.
If you see an extremist is Muslim in Europe, there's a good chance their profile picture is London.
I challenge you to Mahaba to humiliate you.
Yeah.
So I could have Many of Mutawais.
I'm not saying all Muslims going to Europe are bad. That's obviously wrong. But like, the point is that like, the Muslims in Russia, but like Russia is not like a race. Russia is not a totally European country, unlike what he makes out to be. Russia has a very large Muslim population. They have a very large Siberian population that
Actually, how can Russia be majority European when it's Slavic? Benjamin Franklin already ordered this issue.
But I also want to mention the fact that so this idea that if you're actually if you're looking at purely European Christian at all, like Russia is they may be more than America. That's actually widely up for debate. I would say they're probably not more than America.
Well, Christian is.
It might be more. It might be more European. They're not more Christian.
Well, Christian is definitely not as high as America, especially like the Bible Belt. And plus, their version of Christianity is kind of like, the Greek Orthodoxy were too sane for us, so we went off to like peddle weird conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so I don't want to talk about religion too much. The point is that it's to say the idea that Russia is like a pure European country. It's kind of ludicrous.
Yeah. Their church has also links to the KGB. Just want to throw that out, in terms of how the modern Russian Orthodox Church was established.
Yeah. The thing is, I think the Orthodox Church in Russia is more of a political tool than an actual faithful Orthodox
It is.
Church.
There's a reason they left Constantinople, technically.
Yeah, didn't the church in Constantinople kick them out?
Well, there was a schism.
Yeah.
They technically can't kick them out but that's another topic. That's just Orthodox politics.
Yeah. I don't necessarily think we need to talk about Orthodox Christianity next time, so we're going to move on.
Christian identification in Russia actually grew from 30% in the Soviet era to over 70% by 2014. Many Western countries followed in the same boat as America, becoming pro-gay, pro-mass immigration, and hostile to traditional understandings of religion.
To be honest,
the world stage as we
Europe
know it.
didn't follow America and being pro. Europe was probably more pro-gay than the U.S. It still is, and it has been for some time. America didn't actually remove its sodomy laws until 2003.
You also have to remember the fact that America. See, he claims that America was always hostile to Russia starting in the 90s, but the problem is that, first of all, America had mass immigration from non-European countries, starting in the 60s with the Hart-Celler Act. But so also to mention the fact that LGBT stuff was widely not accepted in America pretty much until the 2010s. Which was long after the period of time that he was arguing that America started being hostile to Russia.
Right. I believe the first country to legalize gay marriage was the Netherlands in 2001, I believe. So Europe was ahead of us when it came to that.
Yeah. And the point is that, America, we also have to remember the fact that Europe, that Europeans, at least America was much more expansionist than Europe at the time. We took a much more initiative in foreign policy in Europe at the time. So, but that's not necessarily to mention the fact that LGBT stuff in America was not widely accepted until 2010s. So
and
it literally has nothing to do America. It has nothing to do with America being hostile to Russia. America would dislike Russia regardless of whether it was pro or anti-LGBT. That's just
absolutely
not true.
It was set, and it would lead to the Russia-Ukraine war. In 2008, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, William J. Burns, wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. American officials were fully aware that Ukraine joining NATO was something that no one in the Russian leadership could tolerate, whether they be in Putin's circle or his liberal critics. Nevertheless, in 2014, the US government under Barack Obama backed the infamous Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. This revolution overthrew the Russia-friendly government of Viktor Yanukovych and replaced it with a pro-NATO government. John McCain, Victoria Nuland, and other American government officials were literally on the ground in Ukraine cheering as it happened. They didn't even bother to hide their involvement. Just a week before the coup occurred, there was a leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland speaking about the Ukrainian opposition as if she controlled it. When asked about how the EU would react to all of this, she replied, "F the EU."
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
That's how much she cared about European interests. And people listening to this in the EU area should seriously consider that. In response to this coup, the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine, such as Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, immediately...
phone call.
No, Nigel Farage heard fuck the EU and thought the US was based for it.
Legit. But yeah, the point is, the Ukrainian government and opposition of that time invited the US to help mediate what was going on. The deal was that Yanukovych would stay president and one of the opposition members would become prime minister. And we were discussing the people who'd already been proposed from the opposition parties and which would be the best to take that deal. We weren't sinisterly picking the next Ukrainian government.
Do you think that at the time the United States, can you provide a source about this? Like, this saying that the United States only moderated between the, two sides of Ukraine, as opposed to coming in and being like, oh, we're going to handpick a Ukrainian government. Like, order a Ukrainian government from wish.com.
No, so... yeah, I'll find something. But, to include in the sources. But, yeah, keep playing. That's basically the myth about the Nuland phone
immediately
call.
Rose up in rebellion against the new Ukrainian government. Kiev declared them all to be terrorists and launched what it called an anti-terrorist operation to destroy them. Russia, seeing the opportunity, gladly stepped in to back these separatists and annexed Crimea. Crimea had long been disputed between Russia and Ukraine.
The separatists, quote unquote, were mainly were led by Russian citizens, including one Igor Girkin, who straight up led a band of armed criminals across the border to attack Ukrainian forces. And he admitted later that same year in an interview to starting the war, basically. He said he was the one who pulled the trigger. And again, I want to say that this guy calls the Maidan a U.S. conspiracy when the leaders of the separatist movement in Donbass, quote unquote, were literal Russian citizens.
Yeah. Can you post the whole thing about Gherkin saying that it was started by the Russians?
Hang on, I'm finding that. All right, here we go. All right. So yeah, he straight up admitted that. So yeah, I sent it to the chat.
All right.
This was seen by Moscow as the chance to settle the issue once and for all. A war began between the Russian-backed separatists of eastern Ukraine and the US-UK-backed government in Kiev. The New York Times reported plainly in 2024, the partnership between the CIA and Defense Intelligence of Ukraine began in late February 2014, so immediately upon the Ukrainian government changing. It was recently revealed in declassified documents that the CIA built 12 military bases on the front lines in Donbass. meaning America was already directly involved in the combat.
America built military bases in Ukraine.
We did not. We absolutely did nothing of the sort. Oh my gosh.
You're the bro. America built 12 military bases in Ukraine.
Oh. Oh my god.
No,
not at all.
Not only that, America wouldn't freaking do that, and the reason we wouldn't do that is because we would be at the great risk of losing a military base, which, if it happened, would be a major political scandal.
It would. It absolutely would. And so, no. We did not have U.S. military bases in Ukraine.
This idea that America would build 12 military bases in Ukraine is ludicrous.
It is.
Also, America doesn't put its military bases on the front lines. Like, when has America ever done that?
No, it is absolutely, especially not in a country undergoing active invasion. Like, they would have discovered those had they been there. No, I think what it might be just a bungled reference to spy bases, which were there because Russia was attacking.
Yeah, and stuff that Russia also has too in other countries.
Yeah, including the U.S. and especially Ukraine.
Yeah, so this argument's kind of moot. Like, when he makes it as if the United States was building the Americans are building like another they're building 12 Ramsteins in Ukraine.
Right there, right next to Russia's border. Shocking.
That is absurdly dumb. Obviously, we would not do that. Like,
no, just no.
They're just like, oh yeah, no, we're just gonna build like a bunch of military bases, like right on the shores of our. Like, come on,
no,
this is laughable. America doesn't do that. All right, let's move on.
The leader of the Ukrainian SBU later said these bases were the reason the Ukrainian state didn't collapse. What all this means is that Ukraine was already a total US proxy in 2014. Throughout 2014 and 2015, there were various attempts at diplomatic resolutions to the conflict between Russia and the new Ukrainian government. The most important were the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to halt the fighting and give Donetsk and Luhansk more autonomy as part of Ukraine. But these agreements broke down, with both sides accusing the other of violating them. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who helped facilitate the Minsk Accords, later stated that they were an attempt to give time to Ukraine. One could interpret these remarks to mean that Ukraine signed the Minsk Accords in bad faith. The new Ukrainian government escalated the conflict to new heights by repealing the neutrality clause in its constitution that declared Ukraine would not join any foreign alliances.
Yeah. I also want to mention the fact that Merkel didn't actually arm Ukraine. She
famously refused to.
Yeah. She was literally saying that to save her ass. She wasn't like actively arming Ukraine. If anything, she was actively making up excuses for her own failure to arm Ukraine.
Exactly. No, she said most of that in hindsight.
So yeah, it's something that she, wants us to believe, but like it's just not true. Merkel did not arm Ukraine. If anything,
she was very famously dovish on this.
Yeah. Well, Merkel was like very famously kind of soft on Russia, especially with the Nord Stream pipeline being the biggest example to go up there. But yeah, time to move on.
Ukrainian officials now stated their intention to officially join NATO. From 2014 to 2022, the war between the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government continued with no end in sight. Many Ukrainians spoke out against the Maidan Revolution, such as the journalist Oles Buzinia and the politician Oleg Kalashnikov. Pro-Maidan partisans on the website Miro Tvorets added dissidents
so basically, people who were in the governing party that the Maidan Revolution was going to overthrow was against the Maidan Revolution.
Pow! Mind blown!
It literally says the guy he mentioned was in the Party of Regions.
Yeah. Amazing how the party deposed by a revolution opposes the revolution.
Guys, I also think like Tsar Nicholas opposed the Russian Revolution, but I wouldn't know much about that.
Fake news. He was the greatest Leninist out there.
True.
Like this to an online kill list where their personal information and addresses were published. As a result, they and dozens of others like them were gunned down in the street or found dead in suspicious circumstances. Even Western publications like Newsweek called for these murders to be properly investigated by Ukraine, but they never were. When Trump came into office in 2017, it was once again thought that things might change, that America and Russia could maybe bury the hatchet. But they didn't. The Trump administration continued very similar policies toward Russia as all of his predecessors. Despite all the false claims that Trump and Putin are friends, Trump as president took many steps to hurt and undermine Russia. His administration first pulled out of a nuclear missile treaty between America and Russia that had been in place since the Cold War. From 2017 on, he also began to actively arm the Ukrainian military. Donald Trump is often thought of as a non-interventionist or a peace president, but the historical record actually shows he's consistently engaged in warmongering actions. Today, he bragged.
This is one point that Pax Tube has. Trump was never really an anti-war president. He probably at best used it as a political campaign. Like, the thing is that, like, okay, Trump isn't opposed to war. He just thinks that every other war done before his term were done by a bunch of bumbling idiots, and that he is going to be the big guy who's going to get everyone else to kneel to him, and he's going to beat the hell out of them, like, when he actually intervenes. Like, you know, Trump believes in this idea that, you know, if you show strength and if you are, like, hawkish in the world stage, you would end up with less wars, and with whatever wars you would end up with, you would win.
Hey, you want to know what Trump's mentality is? It's basically, man, I want peace in Ukraine, I want peace with Israel, but those strikes were awesome as fuck, my dude.
Yeah, that's what Trump believes. Like, Trump was never really an anti-war president.
Look at those big, beautiful bombs.
Big, beautiful kaboom, baby.
Yeah, if anything, he simply believes that, you know, him being aggressive on the world stage will lead to less wars, and that whatever wars would happen, you'd just win, and that he could just intimidate other countries into his will. Like, you know, he's not, like, in any way a peace president. He never really has been.
So, yeah. That's something I will hand to Trump, that he actually did arm Ukraine in 2017, and it actually helped them in the early stages of the invasion.
Yeah, that is something we can actually hand.
We can hand that to him.
Thanks about how he sent weapons such as javelins to the Ukrainian government to kill Russians.
In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. And the expression was that Obama gave sheets and I gave the javelins. That was a big deal. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment.
All in all, Trump is really no different from past American presidents. In 2019, the Rand Corporation released a paper titled Extending Russia, which plotted a plan for America to weaken Russia. One of the chief parts of this plan was to continue arming Ukraine and to brainwash Europe into opposing Russia with America. They spoke about using mass media propaganda to turn the Western world into Russian enemies. In the report section about Ukraine, it
I
openly
don't think you need to turn, especially Eastern Europe.
You do not need to brainwash Eastern Europe against Russia.
That's absurd. It's because America is making media outlets, be anti-Russia. It does not mean we're being actively aggressive towards Russia.
No, like the Poles and Balts and the like have plenty of reasons to do that on their own.
Yeah. Yeah.
States in the risk section that Ukrainians could suffer immensely from America getting further involved in the region. They are, quite frankly, cavalier about expending Ukrainian lives to accomplish their goals. So by the time the 2020s rolled around, with Ukraine actively being funded and armed by the United States as they waged war on ethnic Russians, this is probably the moment Russian officials decided they would have to go to war with Ukraine. Ukraine was turning into a militarized anti-Russia battering ram, getting better armed and more dangerous every year. The New York Times confirmed this by releasing an article in 2025 detailing how since 2014, NATO military officials were directly training and arming the Ukrainian military. Finally, in February 2022, Russia entered the war directly on the side of its ethnic separatists. This began the conflict that makes headlines today. As the conflict escalated, NATO countries responded by getting rid of any ambiguity that they were with Ukraine and fully backed it as a proxy against Russia. America alone, under genocide Joe Biden, sent over $300 billion worth of weapons. It's been declassified that the post-Maidan Ukrainian state was fully dependent on the US militarily and economically. This means that despite the Russia-Ukraine war being framed as a war over sovereignty, Ukraine never had sovereignty to begin with. Russia came out of the Cold War as a new country that could engage in a fresh start. But from the beginning,
okay, so if Russia views Ukraine's military as such a threat, it shouldn't invade. It should not have invaded. It should not have started that war. Does this guy seriously think that the Ukrainian military was going to invade Russia? I mean, like, the real reason is Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be independent. And having a strong military is a deterrence against Russian attack. So that is why they did it. It wasn't because of any threat from the Ukrainian side.
You also have to mention the fact that many times having an offensive and a defensive military are just structured in very different ways.
Yes, and the Ukrainian military was a defensive military, right? And there was no evidence that they were going to launch a big campaign to reclaim the Donbass separatist region on the eve of Russia's invasion. That was propaganda. Clashes in the war started to escalate after Russia had massed its forces on the border, not before.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that, Russia was the first one to amass its forces on the border.
Yes.
War over sovereignty, Ukraine never had sovereignty to begin with.
It made the sovereign decision to align with the West.
Russia came out of the Cold War as a new country that could engage in a fresh start. But from the beginning, it was hamstrung by aggressive financiers who wanted to plunder its resources. Then, when a Russian president defeated those financiers, America sought to undermine Russia in every conceivable way it could, whether it be supporting internal rebellions or destroying its allies. And today, Donald Trump has continued the policies of past American administrations, including even engaging in bad faith diplomatic outreach to Russia. Remember Hillary Clinton with the reset button. Secretary of State Pete Hegseth has gone on record telling Europe to rearm to fight Russia so America can focus on China. That is not de-escalation.
The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front.
Do you hear that, Europeans? America started this war, and now you need to finish it on the front lines. Die fighting Russia, just like the Ukrainians are. Europeans, please don't fall for this. So, who is the main party to blame for the Russia-Ukraine war? It's America. It's always been America. It will continue to be America until the American state ends its policy of seeking unipolar world domination. Russia isn't the country here seeking to dominate the world. And ultimately, what has the Maidan revolution brought Ukraine?
It's not seeking to dominate the world because it can't.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, if they had the power they did under the USSR, yeah, they would be. But they just don't have that capacity, so they're reduced to whining about those stronger than them.
Yeah, the thing is, the USSR actively did want world domination, though.
They did, famously. Ideological world domination.
Like, literally, the ideological, the USSR was communist, and they literally thought, they dreamt of, a world revolution.
No, so, again, this guy says America started the war in Ukraine. No, we did not make Russia invade. We're not responsible for overthrowing the Ukrainian government. We are not responsible for Russia seeking to dominate its neighbors. And we're not even asking Europe to die for us. I do not know how he got that from the statement. The point is for them to carry the better share of their own defense to deter Russia, not start another war. It's like these people are they have to be deliberately disingenuous. There's no way this is what they get from that.
And plus, I think even in its weakened state, you have people like Dugan who do unironically have world conquest streams.
Yeah. Yeah, he very famously does in Foundations of Geopolitics.
He wrote a book about it.
Foundations of Geopolitics.
Right, and his actual influence on Putin is overstated, but it's a trend that exists in the Russian elite.
Yeah, but isn't Dugan viewed as an intellectual among the Russian elite?
He is, though Putin probably doesn't have his ear. Not directly.
Yeah.
It's essentially been destroyed, and NATO is happy to feed as many Ukrainians to their deaths as it can, simply to hurt Russia. Hundreds of thousands have died, while millions of
Ukrainians... Trump was literally recently begging Putin on his knees to end the war.
Yeah! Yeah, that's what's so horrifying about this, is it's literally he's literally the opposite of the truth. Trump has cut aid to Ukraine briefly to try just begging to get Putin to the table, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah. But that's the point. If the West are really the aggressor, why isn't Putin ended the war with Trump trying to be so dovish with him?
And that's the answer. That question answers itself. Putin doesn't want to end the war. He wants conquest. He wants domination. This is not because of what the U.S. did. This is not because of U.S. supposed plans for world domination. This lies entirely at the feet of Russia.
Yeah, and I think this proves it because you see Trump literally begging on his knees, Putin saying, end the war! And it's no.
Vladimir, stop!
Vladimir, stop! Like it's some freaking anime or whatever. Jesus.
Come on.
Ukrainians have fled and may never return. The Ukrainian economy is in tatters, while the Russian economy is growing faster than many European countries. The tens of thousands of sanctions which were meant to destroy Russia failed. The world has observed all of this.
Maybe America is not a country that can clutch its pearls and do literally everything it wants.
Yeah, has he considered that?
Yeah.
Hey, is that third guy who was with you back or something? Because I just saw something in the chat.
Let me... Oh, wait. Phoenix wants to join. Let me let him in. Hello. How you doing?
Hello.
I'm finishing up a video on Ukraine. Oh, hey, Phoenix. How you been? Yeah, I'm just finishing up. We're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war.
All right.
All right, yeah, we're just about to finish, and then I might go to bed soon.
In 2024, another US-backed color revolution in Georgia failed. The Prime Minister of Georgia even declared there will be no
What an
Maidan
unattractive
In the last 4 years alone, we
that
have
is
seen
like-
2 attempts from overseas to stage and
Okay,
finance
I'm
a
just gonna say-
revolution, but both failed.
I wouldn't want
As a
that
result,
guy just based on his looks.
Legit. I mean,
Like look and no look. Like here's the thing. Like I don't care if he was like pro-Western. That is a guy who's
that disqualifies him.
like look, it could be if that guy was like pro-West and it was like between him and like an attractive I would have choose the pro-Russia guy.
Right, and again, this is a conspiracy theory a pro-Russian conspiracy theory that he is peddling. This wasn't actually a U.S.-sponsored revolution. That it's still ongoing. Like, there are still protests in Georgia, and even with USAID being shut down and everything. So that's clearly not why they're happening.
Well, the point is that even with USAID being shut down, there are still protests happening in these countries.
Right, so no, this is not whatever he thinks a color revolution is.
Yeah, it's just like, now, regardless of your opinion, I know Phoenix over here might have differing opinions on American intervention than we do, but the thing is that the idea that, like, you know, people would magically stop protesting against their governments once the Americans stop doing it is just utterly ridiculous.
Right, and it should have been proven wrong long ago, but apparently they still need to see what's going on now.
The point is that people in non-Western countries actually have dislike for their governments over similar things to people in the West.
Truly mind-blowing.
Like, yeah, the idea that, you know, people in these countries dislike their governments for the same reasons we do is somehow a foreign concept to certain people. But yeah.
Right.
the third attempt at a revolution will fail too. In Georgia, of course, there will be no Maidan. You know what Maidan has brought to Ukraine. Some people want a repeat of that scenario in Georgia, but there will be no Maidan in Georgia.
And while all this is going on, the American government, for all its attempts...
Wait, why is Net 7 over here?
I'm not sure.
Oh,
anyway, so yeah, we basically covered the video as it is. It's the bog standard pro-Russian narrative with a right-wing twinge and some traces of.
I don't think we did it. It's like the whole, like, you know, a lot of these talking points are very similar to what the far left says.
Yeah, they're copy-pasted in most cases.
Yeah, but there are some differences, like, you know, bringing up the Jewish heritage of
the
people.
Not relevant at all. So yeah, I think we basically debunked the main points of this video, and I
think we did. I'll go copy all the sources and download them
into the thing, and
yeah.
It's been fun, and good night. I'll see you guys later.
See you, Zensobag.
Hey, take care. Bye.
Bye. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, hey, Phoenix. How have you been, by the way? Oh. You left. Okay, yeah, my bad. But, yeah. I stopped the recording.